So we've been making our way through the book of 1 Peter. If you're a visitor, that's just the context of what we've got. So there might be things that I say that from previous messages that you might not have a full context, but I'm sure that you'll understand what we're focusing on. And as we're making our way through 1 Peter, we've really focused on this issue of the people who are in the various places that Peter has written to in Bithynia and Galatia and Pontus. They are really challenged about having to fit into the society that is there at the moment. And the part of fitting in is, it is really hard, and we have this call as well, to live a consistent Christian life. So as we think about that, how many of us find it difficult to live a consistent Christian life? Where we feel guilty about the ungodly actions that we have. Where we're in front of not yet believers and we know that our behaviour does not match the standard that we want to show. Or we might say, okay, I can't do everything right, so I'll set up a series of rules for my life. And if I can just have those rules, if I can somehow achieve that little part of my world, then that makes me a good Christian. And that enables me to go forward. But the problem with this whole thing of consistency and being a good Christian and everything like that is what it actually does. It creates two classes of Christianity. There's the Christian who is good, and then there is the Christian who's not so good. And then around that becomes the other issue of we start identifying each other as good Christians or not so good Christians. And so this issue of living for Christ in grace and implementing His words is actually a very confusing issue for a lot of people. And we get very confused. And we get to this point where we say, I just struggle with it sometimes. And there's all these mixed messages that we're getting. So what I'm hoping today as we work through this next section of 1 Peter is that we get to understand, what does it mean to be a Christian in this world? What does it mean and what does it not mean? So that's what we're going to focus on this morning. And to do that, we're going to have a look at 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 to 17. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 to 17. And prior to this, chapters 1 and the first half of chapter 2, Peter's really set out the relationship that we have with Christ. He's really focused on that really, really importantly, especially in chapter 2. Jesus is the cornerstone. Jesus is the one that we need to hold on to no matter what. We come to Him as living stones. We become part of the building. And so He's established that. Now He's saying, well, now that this is established, now what? And from really chapter 2, verse 11 onwards, it's how do you apply living as God's people in this world? So chapter 2:11 is the first part of that application process. I know that a lot of the NIV versions or a lot of Bibles have a big break there at between verses 12 and 13. That's a bit misleading. The section is actually 11 through to 17, and that's what we're going to focus on. Dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits us. Submit yourself, for the Lord's sake, to every authority instituted among men, whether it is to the king as the supreme authority, or to governors, who are sent by Him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. Live as free men, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the brotherhood of believers. Fear God and honour the King. And we're not going to be able to cover all of that because there's really quite a lot to go in there. But really the question that Peter is asking us and getting us to think about is to recognise that when we are Christians, our status in this world changes. So prior to becoming a Christian, we basically just fit in. We do what the world does. We live as the world lives. We have this self-focus. We have a desire for materialistic gain. We have our attitudes towards relationships are worldly attitudes. And so it's very easy for us to say, yes, I am one of the crowd. But then after that, we stand out. So no longer do we fit and amongst the people who we are in, we actually stand out. And we find ourselves, or we should find ourselves, after we've come to Christ, we should find ourselves feeling uncomfortable. And so we'll think about the use of our language, the words that come out of our mouth, and that will start to transform. And we'll feel uncomfortable when we use language that other people are using in the world. The way that we spend our weekends and our holidays. That'll be different. We'll have different priorities. Our life will have a different focus. So there will definitely be a difference. And that's what becoming Christianity does. That our status in this world changes. We change from being one who fits in to an alien and to a stranger. That's what Peter calls us, doesn't he? In verse 11, he says, you are aliens and you are strangers. The word alien in the context or in that culture was the word that was used to describe people who didn't have the full rights as citizens, but they were accepted into the community. Resident aliens, they used to call them. They had legal protection. But this word stranger was a word that's related to being in exile. In that culture particularly, and in that time, very few people moved from their homeland. It was not a fluctuant group of people moving around. So if you moved or went away from your homeland, it usually meant you did something wrong. And people would be suspicious of you. You were running away from a problem, or you'd been sent into exile. You've come to this place. And so when a new person comes to town, everyone's just, oh, that person's a stranger. And we will have nothing to do with that person. That was the sort of attitude that happened there. And what Peter is saying is that when you are part of a community and then you become a Christian, in that community you become an alien and a stranger. That's your status. Because you don't fit in anymore. Because there's a sense where you are in exile. We don't belong in this world. Our citizenship is in heaven. And because we don't belong in this world, we won't feel that we fit into this world. We're a stranger. And Peter is saying, I need you to understand that. I need you to understand this transition. And I need you to understand it because this is how it is always going to be. In Hebrews chapter 11, there's this litany of faith of all these different people who have done faith things. Abraham, Moses, there's all this list of people. And this is what he says in verse 13. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. That phrase there, foreigners and strangers on earth, is the same phrase that Peter uses. Foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had the opportunity to return. Instead, they're longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. You see, this life that we have is a journey. We literally are just passing through. And our citizenship, our home, our place, our residence, the place where we are most comfortable, the place where we fit, it is not here. It is beyond here. When you become a Christian, your status changes. Which presents us with a challenge, doesn't it? Because even though our citizenship is in heaven and Christ is in us and we're called holy and the Spirit works, we've got to live in this world. And we live in a world stained by sin. And we're also struggling as people, as individuals who struggle with sin as well. And so the challenge that we have then as we look at this is to say, well, do I live as one whose status is changed? Now, I'll come back to this point in a minute, but I want us to understand this. I'm not saying, do I live as a Christian? But do I live as one whose status is changed? Do I stand out? We'll come back to that point. It's very important for us to see the difference. I've been called into the family. Now, how am I going to live? And Peter gives us a really clear answer on this. He stresses it 3 times in the space of those 5 verses there that we read. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the talk of ignorant fools. I know that I'm a person who's living a changed status life when I seek to make a difference. That's how I know. That's how I know that I'm making an impact in this world. And this whole concept of doing good, and you can read it later on for yourself and just test us to tell you that see that I'm telling you the truth. If you look for it, look for that word good, it comes up again and again in Peter. And Peter gives us a very comprehensive idea of what it means to do good. Firstly, in relation to the who question, who is to do good? When he uses the word, it directly relates to the city residents, to the local congregation, to masters, to slaves, to women married to non-believers, to the general Christian community, and to those who suffer for Christ. So, who is to do good? Everybody. No matter what status, no matter where you are, no matter what your work, no matter what your hierarchy in life, from the emperor down to the slave, if you are a Christian, you are called to do good. Then the second question becomes, well, what are we supposed to do when we are good? Now, you can do this for yourself, but I've done it for you. These are all the actions or activities that are associated with the word doing good. So, you have a life which causes pagans to make hypocritical judgments about you. Though they see and they make judgment, they will be shown to be fools. Submission to the authorities established by God is doing good. Living as a commendable citizen. Acting in a way that silences ignorant talk. Being considerate to slaves. Bearing unjust physical abuse from harsh taskmasters. Submission to non-believing husbands. Not using evil and deceitful speech. Seeking and pursuing peace. Having an eagerness to do good. Keeping a clear conscience. Causing shame to those who slander you, having a good conscience towards God, and being a good steward of the God-given gifts, and one more, committing good even when it brings suffering. When do I do good? What do I do that's good? Everything. Every aspect of my life changes. Every focus that I have changes. In fact, we could say that Peter is giving us a how to do good manual. And he gives us a whole lot of other ethical commands as well. Don't go back to your spiritual ignorance. Have reverence for God. Show brotherly love. Desire spiritual growth. Ignore the passions of the flesh. Live respectful lives. Live righteous lives. Have humility. Now, as you go through all of that, as you read all of that and you understand what doing good means, I read that and I just went, well, that's impossible. How can I be that sort of person? Because I know my attitudes, I know my strengths, and I know my weaknesses. And there is a sense where it is quite impossible. One of the commands that Peter gives in the section that we read was to submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether the emperor, who is the supreme authority, or to the governors. Honour the emperor. Now we say, well, the emperor is in charge, he deserves honour. But let me tell you what that means. You see, in those days, there was this thing called the emperor cult. And in every town, in every city of a substantial size, even small cities, there would be a temple dedicated to the emperor. And it would sit usually on the highest place in the town. And everybody in the town would go there to give an offering to the emperor, to worship the emperor. But not only that, there were all these things called guilds. And these different guilds, the Carpenters Guild and the Metal Workers Guild and the Water Collectors Guild and the Town Protection Guild, they had all these guilds. And no matter what you did for a job, you would be expected to belong to one of these guilds. It's kind of like a union, but it's different. But that's the idea. You gather all the people who do the same thing, and then by having the strong voice together, they can impact in the town. That was the idea. But being part of this guild meant you had to go to the guild festivals. And that meant that you would go to the temple and you would offer to various temple gods various sacrifices to help your particular area of work go well. And not only that, all towns had all these festivals. And all of these festivals, everyone was expected to go there, and they were dedicated to various gods. And the idea of these festivals was to make the gods happy. And again, the people were expected to go there. Now you imagine being a Christian there. Imagine you're a Christian who is the baker. You're the baker and you become a Christian, and now you're part of the Bakers Guild. And you're expected to help the bakery go well. You're expected to go up to the temple and to offer sacrifices to the emperor. And you're expected to participate in all of these different festivals so that the bakery will go well. And if you don't, people will look at you and say, don't you care about being a good citizen? Don't you care about bakery? Don't you care that we have a good harvest of wheat so that we can have better bread? You see, it's huge pressure. Honouring the emperor in that situation is huge amounts of pressure. You know, we sit here in Australia and we whinge and complain about our government and we think they're so terrible. We have no idea. Imagine if we had a life where we had to go and literally give homage and bow down to Tony Abbott. Imagine that. Now everyone laughs, but that's what it was. You see, you know, we complain about our leaders and we shouldn't, but we do. But there were some emperors who were worse than Tony Abbott. Seriously. They did not deserve honour. But because they were called in that society to do so, that was the expectation. It's hard to be a Christian. And there were some Christians in those days who had to compromise, and they did compromise, and it was very difficult for them to do. Now, the point I want to get across is this. Doing good means standing out, not fitting in. But as we do good, let's never confuse doing good or a failure to do good as the standard which defines whether you are a Christian or you're not a Christian. And that's a really important thing that we need to understand. You see, you can be a person who does not submit to authority. You can break the road rules. That's not submitting to authority. You can disparage the leaders. That's not submitting to authority. You can avoid taxation. You can do that. But you can still be a Christian. You see, you just won't be a Christian who stands out and makes a huge difference in this world. You can be a person who uses your freedom in Christ as a cover-up for sin. Peter says, don't use your freedom to cover up for sin. But you can do that if you want. You can be a person who says, well, I can do whatever I want. God has to forgive me anyway. I've always been this way and Jesus just has to understand. I've been yelling at the traffic since I was 16. I'm not going to change and Jesus just has to accept that. Unconditional love. People use this. Unconditional love means you have to accept me so I don't have to change. You can do that, and still be a Christian. But you just won't be a Christian who stands out. You see, I know Christians who swear. And I know Christians who have had affairs. And I know Christians who are addicts. I know Christians who have stolen. I know Christians who got pregnant outside of marriage. I know Christians who have road rage. I know Christians like that. And so do you. You see, the reality is they're in this room, aren't they? Maybe they're in the row that you're sitting in. If you're sitting by yourself, that's awkward, isn't it? But anyway, Michelle can't deflect anything. But isn't that the reality? It's you, isn't it? Aren't we people as Christians who fall short all the time? Aren't we people as Christians? We say we love the Lord, we love Jesus, we're committed to His cause, and we want to live for Him and we want to be an example. But aren't there days when you just go to bed and you say, God, I did not live for you at all today. And what I did at that point was not a good example of what it means to stand out in this world and make a difference. That's the reality of who we are. But as we go through that, let's not confuse that aspect of our life and says, because I do these things, that means I am not a good Christian. I am not a Christian. You see, Peter starts off this section, doesn't he? And how does he start? He says, dear friends. Dear friends, 2 verse 11. Dear friends. Isn't it great that Peter writes it, I think? Now, because Peter understands what it means to be a friend of Jesus Christ, doesn't he? Because he walked with Jesus for 3 years. But remember that this is the same Peter who Jesus once said to him, get behind me, Satan. Because Peter didn't understand what Jesus was on about at all. And this is the same Peter who Jesus said to him, I'm going to have to pray for you, Peter, because you're going to fall, and I'm going to pray that Satan doesn't take you away for good. And this is the same Peter who Jesus had to restore, and he says 3 times to him, Peter, do you love me? Because you really let me down, Peter. I told you that was going to happen, and you still didn't listen. You're so stubborn, Peter. It's that same Peter who even Paul one time had to chastise. So Jesus is gone, he's gone to heaven. This is 15, maybe 20 years after Jesus is gone. Peter's been around for a while. This is what we read in Galatians. Paul's writing. When Cephas, who is Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, so before they came from Jerusalem, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when the men from James came, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in the hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy even Barnabas was led astray. Even Peter, after all this time, Paul says, you're wrong, mate. That's not the right behaviour. That's not how a person who lives for Jesus needs to act. You're not standing out. But that doesn't make Peter any less of a Christian. You see, we've got to get out of our mindset that somehow Christianity, being a Christian, means, okay, here is a scale. And the good Christians are up this end, and the not so good Christians are up this end, and then somewhere along the way, depending on how you judge it, okay, here's the point. And as long as you don't go that side of the point, you can still call yourself a Christian. But if you're on that side of the point, if you put yourself that way, you're not a Christian. But if you're that side, you are. It doesn't work like that. Because if it worked like that, we'd have to get to the end of every day and say, God, am I a Christian today? Wouldn't we? This is why I say we have to understand how this idea of works. Peter's not writing these things to say, okay, let me define for you what it means that you can determine whether you're a Christian or not. How do you become a Christian? We saw it last week. We believe that we are chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God who have been shown mercy through Jesus Christ. That's what makes us part of the family. All this other stuff that we're talking about, this is, now what am I going to do? How am I going to live? This is the question that Peter's going to ask us again and again. What are you going to do now? Are you just going to blend in? Or are you going to stand out? Are you going to blend in as your Christian and change nothing? Are you going to be one of those people who becomes a Christian when they're 20 and you meet them 40 years later and they haven't grown hardly? Are you going to be one of those people? Or are you going to be one of these people that goes out in the world and you see them and they're just everyone sees that there's something different about it. The non-Christians, they don't know what's going on and they think he's crazy, but they know something's going on. And all these people are looking at him and saying, oh, you know, you're such a God person. You know, but they don't even know what to say, do they? All these words, hypocrisy that they say against us. Is that what you want to be? Are you prepared to stand out? That's the challenge that Peter's putting before us. We are brothers and sisters united in Christ, called to serve, called to encourage. But also we should be encouraging each other. Let's try and stand out. Let's try and stand out for the Lord. Let's make a difference in this world. Let's make such a difference that in the end, even the pagans will be silenced by what we do, because they know that God's doing something through each one of us. Let's pray. Father, I want us to really understand the connection between grace and works. And Peter's helping us to understand that this morning, God. And I'm asking, Lord, that we understand as we apply your word, that we don't get driven by this works righteousness approach, where we judge ourselves and we judge others on the basis of what we do or we don't do, of how we live or how we don't live. Lord, it's not like our Christianity stops in the middle of the day because we have done something that's not pleasing to you. But our witness for you and our impact for the kingdom is impacted, God. And we want to be people who stand out. Lord, you've given us so much. And we ask, God, help us to stand out. We're going to see in the next few weeks, God, what that looks like in the workplace. What that looks like in relationship. What that looks like in the community at large. Lord, help us to realise the significance of these things. And Lord, stop us from judging each other. Stop us from looking at each other and defining the other person by whether they're a so-called good Christian or not so good Christian. Rather, help us to get alongside each other. Let's walk this road together, God. Help us to stop and pick up those who are struggling, who are Christians, but their witness for you is really hampered. Lord, help us to be a praying community for those who are hobbling along. Enable us to walk this road together, Lord, because even in that, our witness to the world is so powerful. Today, God, let us walk away from here, assured in the understanding that we belong to you, but with a greater commitment to stand out, because that's the calling you have for us. Hear our prayer, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen.